The sun hung like a brass coin in the bleached sky, bearing down on the town of Redemption Creek with the weight of judgment itself. Dust devils danced between the weathered buildings, carrying with them the prayers and curses of those who had tried to tame this unforgiving land. At the eastern edge of town, where civilization gave way to endless prairie, stood a modest wooden chapel, its whitewashed boards peeling like old skin under the relentless assault of wind and time. Sarah McKenna stood in the doorway of the small house adjoining the chapel, her slender frame silhouetted against the dim interior. The widow's weeds she wore seemed to absorb the very light around her, making her appear as a shadow given form. It had been 6 months since they'd lowered Reverend Thomas McKenna into the hard-packed earth behind the chapel. 6 months since she'd become the town's living monument to propriety and grief. The afternoon heat pressed against her like a living thing, but Sarah remained motionless, watching the town below with eyes that had forgotten how to truly see. Redemption Creek sprawled before her in a collection of false-fronted buildings and dreams gone to seed. The general store, the blacksmith's shop, the Broken Wheel Saloon, all of them monuments to mankind's stubborn refusal to admit defeat in the face of an indifferent wilderness. "Mrs. McKenna," called a voice from below. Mrs. Adelaide Hutchins, the banker's wife, stood at the base of the hill, her parasol tilted against the sun. "The Ladies' Aid Society meets in an hour. We do hope you'll join us." Sarah's lips curved in what might have been mistaken for a smile. "Of course, Mrs. Hutchins. I wouldn't miss it." The older woman nodded approvingly before continuing her trek down Main Street, her bustle swaying with self-importance. Sarah watched her go, knowing that her attendance at the meeting wasn't really optional. The widow of a preacher had obligations, a role to play in the moral theater of the frontier. She was expected to be a beacon of virtue, a reminder that even in this lawless land, God's order could prevail. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the western road, where a lone rider emerged from the heat shimmer like a specter. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to the cross at her throat as she watched his approach. There was something different about this traveler, something in the way he sat his horse, not with the rigid propriety of the townsman or the rough swagger of the local cowboys, but with a fluid grace that spoke of countless miles and unnumbered horizons. The stranger rode a dusty bay mare, his face obscured by the shadow of a weathered hat. As he drew closer to the town's edge, Sarah could make out more details: the worn leather of his coat, the silver glint of spurs, the easy way his hand rested near the pistol at his hip. He rode past the chapel without glancing up, but something in the tilt of his head suggested he was aware of her presence. Down in the town, heads turned and conversation stuttered to a halt. Strangers weren't uncommon in Redemption Creek. The town sat on a well-traveled route between Fort Worth and the mining camps to the north. But there was something about this particular stranger that set the locals on edge. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with the controlled grace of a man who had learned that sudden movements could mean death. Or perhaps it was simply that he rode alone, without the usual trappings of commerce or companionship that marked most travelers. Sarah watched as he dismounted in front of the Broken Wheel, tying his horse to the rail with practiced efficiency. When he pushed through the saloon's batwing doors, she could almost hear the collective intake of breath from the good citizens of Redemption Creek. A drifter, they would whisper. A man with no roots, no name worth knowing, no place in their carefully ordered world. She turned back to her house, closing the door against the heat and the questions that the stranger's arrival had stirred. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of lye soap and old wood. Every surface was spotlessly clean, cleanliness being next to godliness, as Thomas had often preached. The furniture sat in rigid formation, each piece exactly where her late husband had placed it. Nothing had been moved since his death, as if by maintaining the physical order of their life together, she could somehow preserve its meaning. In the kitchen, Sarah mechanically prepared for the Ladies' Aid meeting, slicing a cake she had no appetite for and brewing tea that would taste like dust in her mouth. Through the window, she could see the cemetery where Thomas lay, his headstone standing straight and true among the tilted markers of those who had come before. A good man. The townspeople said, a man of God who had brought the Lord's word to the wilderness. And she had been a good wife, supporting his ministry, tending his home, never questioning the path the Lord had set before them. The sound of breaking glass from the direction of the saloon interrupted her thoughts. Sarah didn't need to look to know what was happening. The stranger's presence would have upset the delicate balance of the Broken Wheel's regular patrons. There would be words exchanged, challenges issued. The eternal dance of men trying to establish dominance in a world that recognized only strength. An hour later, Sarah made her way down the hill to the Hutchins parlor, where the Ladies' Aid Society had gathered like a flock of black birds. The conversation, as always, centered on the moral failings of others and the constant battle against the corrupting influences of the frontier. "Did you see that drifter who rode in?" Mrs. Hutchins asked, her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room. Bold as brass, walking into the saloon in broad daylight. "No good will come of it," agreed Mrs. Templeton, the schoolmarm. "Such men bring nothing but trouble. Violence follows them like a shadow." Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, playing her expected role, but behind her downcast eyes, she found herself thinking of the stranger, of the way he had ridden into town as if he owned the very air he breathed. When had she last felt that kind of freedom? When had she last moved through the world without the weight of others' expectations pressing down on her shoulders? "Mrs. McKenna," Mrs. Hutchins said, turning her sharp gaze on Sarah. "You must be especially careful. A widow alone, living by the chapel. It wouldn't do for such a man to take any liberties." "Of course not," Sarah murmured, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever they reminded her of her precarious position. A widow without family, without independent means, existing on the charity of the church and the goodwill of the community. One false step, one breath of scandal, and she would find herself cast out, another casualty of the frontier's unforgiving nature. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Sarah made her way back to the chapel. The town had taken on its evening character, louder voices from the saloon, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of harsh laughter. She quickened her pace, eager to be behind her own door before full dark, but as she reached the top of the hill, she stopped. There, sitting on the wooden steps of the chapel, was the stranger. He had removed his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with premature silver and a face carved by wind and weather. He was rolling a cigarette with steady hands, seemingly oblivious to the impropriety of his presence on sacred ground. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as their eyes met. His were gray, the color of storm clouds over the prairie, and they regarded her with a directness that made her feel suddenly uncomfortably visible. For a long moment, neither spoke. The evening air hung between them, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of social conventions. Then he smiled, not the polite, practiced smile of the townsman, but something rawer, more honest. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the traces of distant places. "Fine church you have here." Sarah knew she should rebuke him, should order him off the church steps and back to whatever shadow had spawned him. That's what Thomas would have done, what the town expected her to do. Instead, she heard herself saying, "My husband built it. He was the minister here." Was. The stranger's eyes sharpened, taking in her black dress, the careful distance she maintained. "My condolences, ma'am. Recent? 6 months. The words came out harder than she intended, edged with a bitterness she hadn't known she harbored. He nodded slowly, then rose to his feet with that same fluid grace she'd noticed earlier. "Jack Corrigan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'll be moving on in a day or two. Didn't mean to disturb your evening." As he walked past her, heading down toward the town, Sarah caught the scent of leather and tobacco and something else, the wild smell of open spaces and unlimited horizons. She stood frozen, watching his retreating figure, feeling as if something fundamental had shifted in the world. The stranger, Jack Corrigan, had looked at her and seen not the preacher's widow, not the town's moral guardian, but simply a woman standing in the dying light. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the town below. Somewhere, a coyote howled, and its cry seemed to speak of all the wildness that still existed beyond the boundaries of civilization. She thought of gray eyes and steady hands, of a man who moved through the world as if he belonged to no one but himself, for the first time since Thomas's death. Sarah McKenna allowed herself to wonder what lay beyond the confines of Redemption Creek, beyond the role she had been assigned by fate and circumstance. It was a dangerous thought, one that threatened the very foundations of the life she had built, but like the stranger who had brought it, the thought refused to be dismissed. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small dramas of the humans below. And in the darkness of her room, the preacher's widow pressed her face into her pillow and tried not to think about freedom. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Sarah's bedroom, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. She lay still, caught between waking and sleeping, lost in memories that came unbidden like autumn leaves on the wind. Thomas had been a good man, everyone said so. He had found her working in her father's store in St. Louis, a girl of 19 with dreams no bigger than the boundaries of her small world. He had courted her with scripture and promises of purpose, of being part of something greater than herself. "You'll be a helpmeet," he had said, his pale hands folded over his Bible. "Together, we'll bring God's word to the frontier. It's noble work, Sarah, sacred work." And she had believed him, had packed her few belongings and followed him west to this dust-blown town, where the line between salvation and damnation was as thin as morning frost. Thomas had been 15 years her senior, his passion reserved entirely for his sermons and his vision of a godly community carved from the wilderness. Their marriage had been one of duty and propriety, two people sharing a house and a purpose, but never truly sharing themselves. Sarah rose and dressed in her widow's black, her fingers working the buttons by memory. Through the window, she could see the town stirring to life, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against iron. And there, by the water trough near the stable, Jack Corrigan stood washing the trail dust from his face. She found herself watching the way the water ran down his neck, the casual strength in his movements. He was different from the men of Redemption Creek, who moved with either the stiff righteousness of the saved or the shuffling guilt of sinners. Corrigan moved like the wild horses she sometimes saw on the horizon, untamed and unashamed. A sharp knock at her door made her step back from the window, heat rising in her cheeks as if she'd been caught in some impropriety. It was Mrs. Hutchins, come to discuss the church's monthly accounts. Sarah let her in, served tea, and tried to focus on columns of figures while her mind wandered to gray eyes and the scent of distant places. "You seem distracted, dear," Mrs. Hutchins observed, her small eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Are you feeling well?" "Perfectly well, thank you," Sarah replied, forcing her attention back to the ledger. "Just tired. I didn't sleep well last night." "The heat," Mrs. Hutchins agreed, though her expression suggested she suspected other causes. "That drifter is still in town. Spent the night at the boarding house. Mrs. Garrett says he paid in advance. Cash money. Makes you wonder where such a man gets cash money." Sarah made a noncommittal sound, knowing that any response would be dissected and analyzed by the town's gossip mill. After what seemed like hours, Mrs. Hutchins finally departed, leaving Sarah with a pounding headache and a desperate need for air. She stepped outside to tend her small kitchen garden, finding solace in the simple act of coaxing life from the stubborn soil. The tomatoes were beginning to ripen, their red globes promising a taste of something beyond the monotony of beans and salt pork. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across the plants. "Ma'am?" Sarah looked up to find Jack Corrigan standing at the garden gate, hat in hand, in the morning light. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weathering that spoke of years under unforgiving suns. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and white against his tanned skin. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, straightening and brushing the dirt from her hands. "Can I help you?" "Actually, I was hoping I might help you." He gestured toward her small wagon, where one wheel sat at an awkward angle. "Noticed yesterday that you've got a problem there. Wheel's about to come off the axle. Dangerous, especially if you're planning to go to town." Sarah looked at the wagon, seeing what she'd been ignoring for weeks. Thomas had always handled such things, and since his death, she had simply made do, walking when possible and hoping the wagon would hold together when necessary. I hadn't realized," she admitted, hating the helplessness in her voice. "No reason you should," Corrigan said easily. "Takes an eye for such things. I could fix it for you, if you'd like. Wouldn't take but an hour." She should refuse. It wasn't proper for a widow to accept help from a stranger, especially one with Corrigan's reputation. But the practical part of her, the part that had survived 6 months of making do, won out. "I would be grateful," she said quietly, "though I'm afraid I can't pay much." Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, perhaps, or understanding. "Wasn't looking for pay, ma'am, just being neighborly." He set to work with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, producing tools from his saddlebags and attacking the problem with quiet competence. Sarah found herself hovering nearby, ostensibly continuing her garden work, but actually watching the play of muscles beneath his shirt, the sure movements of his hands. "You know about wagons," she observed, immediately feeling foolish for stating the obvious. "Know about a lot of things," he replied without looking up. "Man travels as much as I do. He learns to fix what's broken. Can't always count on finding a blacksmith or a wheelwright when you need one." "Where do you travel?" The question escaped before she could stop it. He glanced up at her, a half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Wherever the road takes me. California for the gold, though that's mostly played out now. Colorado for the silver. Texas for the cattle drives. Oregon Territory once, though it rained too much for my liking." Sarah tried to imagine such freedom, such vastness of experience. Her own world had shrunk from her father's store to Thomas's church, from St. Louis to Redemption Creek. Don't you ever want to settle down? Find a place to belong? "Belonging's a tricky thing," Corrigan said, returning to his work. "Some folks are born to it, like your husband. I'd guess others spend their whole lives looking for it. And some," he shrugged, "some learn that the only place they belong is the next mile of empty road." They worked in companionable silence after that, Sarah tending her plants while Corrigan repaired the wheel. She found herself stealing glances at him, noting the way he handled the tools with the same easy grace he'd shown with his horse. There was a competence about him that was deeply appealing, a self-sufficiency that stood in sharp contrast to the interdependence of town life. "There," he said finally, standing and dusting off his hands. "Should hold now. Though you might want to get the blacksmith to look at it proper when you get a chance." "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning it more than he could know. "Won't you stay for some water? Or coffee? It's the least I can offer." He hesitated, and she could see him weighing propriety against desire. "Water would be welcome," he said finally. She led him to the pump behind the house, conscious of his presence behind her like a physical warmth. As he worked the handle and drank from the tin cup she provided, Sarah found herself speaking without conscious thought. "My husband was a good man," she said. "Everyone says so. He built the church, brought civilization to the wilderness. He saved souls." Corrigan set down the cup and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. "But there is no but," she said quickly, the proper response coming automatically. Then, more quietly, "He was a good man, cold, perhaps distant, more in love with his vision than with, but he was good to me. Gave me a home, a purpose. A cage can be gilded and still be a cage," Corrigan said softly. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, like ice breaking on a frozen pond. "You shouldn't say such things. I shouldn't be talking to you at all. People will talk." "People always talk," he said with a shrug. "Let 'em. You've done nothing wrong." "Mrs. McKenna, neither have I. Man fixes a wagon wheel. Woman offers water. Nothing improper in that. But there was something improper in the way he looked at her, in the way her pulse quickened when he said her name." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the morning warmth. "You should go," she said. "Thank you for your help, but you should go." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be moving on tomorrow, maybe the day after. You won't have to worry about the scandal much longer." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and turned to go, then paused. "But if you need anything before then, anything at all, I'm at Mrs. Garrett's boarding house." Sarah watched him walk away, his long stride eating up the ground between her house and the town. She stood there until he was out of sight, her hands clenched at her sides, fighting the urge to call him back. That evening, as she sat alone in her parlor with her Bible open on her lap, Sarah found herself unable to focus on the familiar words. Instead, she thought about roads that led to distant horizons, about a world beyond the narrow confines of duty and expectation. She thought about warm gray eyes and scarred hands, about what it might feel like to be touched by someone who wanted her for herself, not for what she represented. When she finally slept, she dreamed of wild horses running free across endless plains, their manes streaming like dark water in the wind. And, in her dream, she was running with them, her widow's weeds torn away by the speed of her flight, leaving her naked and unashamed beneath an infinite sky. The following evening brought with it a restlessness that Sarah couldn't shake. She had spent the day in proper pursuits, mending clothes, visiting the sick, reading scripture, but her mind kept wandering to thoughts of elsewhere. As darkness fell, she found herself standing at her window, watching the lights of the town below. The saloon glowed brightest, its windows spilling golden light onto the dusty street. She could hear the distant sound of a piano, someone playing a melancholy tune that spoke of loneliness and lost chances. A movement in the shadows caught her eye. Jack Corrigan stood near the chapel, his figure barely visible in the moonlight. He wasn't approaching the building, just standing there, looking up at the modest steeple that Thomas had been so proud of. Sarah's heart began to race. What was he doing there? What did he want? Before she could think better of it, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Corrigan turned at the sound of her approach, and even in the darkness, she could see his smile. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked softly. "I saw you from the window," Sarah admitted, then felt foolish for the admission. "Is something wrong?" "No, ma'am, just thinking. I used to know a preacher, years back, different from your husband. I'd guess he believed God lived out here." He gestured to the vast darkness beyond the town, in the wild places, not in buildings made by men. Sarah found herself moving closer, drawn by his voice and the ideas it carried. Thomas would have called that blasphemy. He believed in order, in civilization, in taming the wilderness. And what do you believe? The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah had never been asked what she believed, only told what she should believe. "I don't know," she whispered, the admission feeling like a confession. "I used to think I knew, but now—" "Come," Corrigan said suddenly, extending his hand. "Let me show you something." Every proper instinct in her screamed refusal. A widow, alone at night with a stranger. It was beyond scandalous. But something stronger than propriety moved her to place her hand in his. His fingers were warm and calloused, and she felt the contact like a shock through her entire body. He led her away from the chapel, past the cemetery where Thomas lay in his orderly grave, to a small rise that overlooked the prairie. The moon had risen full and bright, turning the landscape into a silver sea that stretched to the horizon. "Look," he said simply. Sarah looked, and for the first time, truly saw. The vastness of it took her breath away. mile upon mile of open land, broken only by the occasional shadow of a mesa or the dark line of a distant creek. The stars overhead were countless, far brighter than they ever seemed from the confines of the town. A coyote howled somewhere in the darkness, and its cry was answered by another, then another, until the night rang with their wild music. "This is what I believe in," Corrigan said quietly. "This is my church. No walls, no rules, no one telling you who to be or how to live. Just space to breathe, to be yourself, to make your own choices." "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, and felt tears sting her eyes. "And terrifying. Freedom usually is." She turned to look at him then. This man who had disrupted her carefully ordered world with his very presence. In the moonlight, his face was all plains and shadows, his eyes reflecting the vast darkness of the sky. "Why did you really stop here?" she asked. "There are other towns, other places to rest." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Maybe I was tired of running. Maybe I saw something that made me want to stop. Just for a while." His hand found hers again, and this time she didn't pretend it was accidental. "Maybe I saw a woman standing in a doorway, looking like she was drowning on dry land. And I thought maybe we could save each other." "I don't need saving," Sarah said automatically, even as her fingers tightened around his. "Don't you?" He moved closer, and she could smell leather and tobacco, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "When's the last time someone touched you just because they wanted to? When's the last time you did something just because it felt good, not because it was proper or expected?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Thomas had touched her, of course, but always with a sort of apologetic efficiency, as if the physical aspects of marriage were a regrettable necessity. And, since his death, she had been as untouchable as a saint statue, preserved in the amber of widowhood. "The preacher's widow hid her desire," Corrigan murmured, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "But I can see it in your eyes. Sarah, I can feel it in the way you tremble when I'm near. You're not dead, no matter how much black you wear. You're alive, and you want things, and there's no sin in that." "Please?" she whispered, not sure if she was begging him to stop or to continue. "Tell me to leave," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Tell me to go back to the boarding house and never speak to you again. Tell me you're content with your prayers and your propriety, and I'll go." Sarah opened her mouth to say exactly that, to send him away and return to her safe, narrow life. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself swaying toward him, drawn like a moth to flame. "I can't," she breathed. "God help me, I can't." His eyes darkened, and for a moment they stood frozen, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Then, with a sound that might have been a curse or a prayer, Corrigan pulled her against him. The kiss was nothing like the chaste pecks Thomas had occasionally bestowed. This was fire and demand, a claiming that shook her to her very foundation. Corrigan's mouth was hard and hungry on hers, his arms iron bands around her body. Sarah gasped, and he deepened the kiss, his tongue sweeping into her mouth with a boldness that should have shocked her. Instead, she found herself responding with a passion she hadn't known she possessed, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body pressing against his as if trying to merge with him completely. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. Sarah's lips felt swollen, branded by his touch. She could still taste him, whiskey and wildness and something essentially male that made her knees weak. "Until the drifter forced a kiss that burned her soul," he quoted softly, his voice rough. "Is that what I've done, Sarah? Burned you?" "Yes," she whispered, and the word was both accusation and admission. "Yes, God help me." She wrenched herself from his arms then, stumbling backward. Her entire body felt alive, every nerve ending singing with awareness. This was what she had been missing, what Thomas's cold propriety had never given her, this feeling of being utterly, completely alive. "I have to go," she gasped, wrapping her shawl tightly around herself as if it could somehow contain the fire he had ignited. This was "We can't. I have to go." Corrigan made no move to stop her, just stood there watching with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "I'll be here tomorrow night," he said quietly. "Same time, if you want to talk, or if you want." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Sarah fled then, running back to her house as if all the demons of hell were at her heels. But the demons, she realized as she slammed her door behind her, were inside her now. Corrigan had awakened something with that kiss, something wild and hungry that she had spent years trying to bury. She spent the rest of the night on her knees in prayer, begging forgiveness for her weakness, for the desire that even now pulsed through her veins like liquid fire. But even as she prayed, she knew with a terrible certainty that come tomorrow night, she would be standing on that hill again, waiting for a gray-eyed drifter to complete her destruction. Or perhaps a small voice whispered in the darkness, waiting for him to complete her salvation. For what was salvation? Really, but the courage to finally, truly live. Dawn came like an accusation, its pale light seeping through the windows of the chapel where Sarah knelt in desperate prayer. She had fled here in the pre-dawn darkness, seeking sanctuary from the memories that tormented her, the heat of Corrigan's mouth, the strength of his arms, the way her body had betrayed every principle she held dear. The wooden floor was hard beneath her knees, but she welcomed the discomfort, hoping it might somehow atone for her weakness. "Forgive me," she whispered to the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. "I have sinned in thought and deed. I have forgotten my place, my duty, the vows I made." But even as she prayed, she could taste him still, could feel the phantom pressure of his lips against hers. The kiss had indeed burned her soul, just as he had said, leaving ash and ember where once there had been only cold propriety. The sound of footsteps made her raise her head. Mrs. Templeton, the schoolmarm, stood in the doorway, her thin face pinched with concern and something else, curiosity, perhaps, or judgment. "My dear Mrs. McKenna," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for those suspected of moral failing. "You're here very early. Is everything well?" Sarah rose stiffly, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. "I couldn't sleep," she said, which was true enough. "I thought to spend some time in prayer." "How devoted you are," Mrs. Templeton murmured, though her eyes remained sharp. "We could all learn from your example, although—" she paused delicately. "You do look rather pale. Are you certain you're not ill?" "Quite certain, thank you." "Well, do take care of yourself. The town depends on you, you know, as the preacher's widow. You carry a special responsibility to maintain the moral standards your dear husband established." The woman's smile was thin as paper. "We wouldn't want anything to compromise that responsibility." The warning was clear as spring water. Sarah met the woman's gaze steadily, though inside she felt hollow as a reed. "Of course not. I understand my position perfectly." After Mrs. Templeton departed, Sarah remained in the chapel, staring at the cross Thomas had carved with his own hands. He had been so proud of it, of the church, of the order he was imposing on the wilderness. She tried to summon his face, to remember the comfort of his certainty, but all she could see were gray eyes and a crooked smile. The day passed in a haze of ordinary tasks. Sarah went through the motions, visiting the sick, helping prepare for Sunday's service, maintaining the facade of the proper widow. But everywhere she went, she felt eyes upon her, as if her sin was written on her face for all to see. When she passed the boarding house, her steps faltered, and she had to force herself to continue walking. It was in the general store that she heard the news. Jake Morrison, one of the ranch hands from the Double Bar, was holding court near the pickle barrel, his voice carrying clearly through the small space. "That drifter's been asking questions," he said, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Wanting to know about the trail north, about the Indian troubles up Montana way. Bart says he saw him cleaning his guns this morning, not just one, but 3 of them. Man doesn't carry that much iron unless he's expecting trouble or planning to cause it. Or running from it," suggested Will Harper, the bank clerk. I heard tell there was some trouble down El Paso way. A man killed over cards, and the shooter lit out heading north. Description matches our visitor pretty close." Sarah's hands tightened on her basket. She wanted to defend Corrigan, to tell them they were wrong. But how could she? What did she really know about him beyond the fact that his kiss had undone her entirely? "Well, he won't find any trouble here," declared Sam Hutchins, the banker and Adelaide's husband. "Sheriff Thompson's keeping an eye on him. One wrong move, and he'll find himself looking at the world through iron bars." "Speaking of keeping an eye on things," Jake said, his gaze sliding to Sarah with unpleasant speculation. "I saw him up near the chapel last night. Mighty late for a man to be studying architecture." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "I wouldn't know anything about that. Mr. Morrison. I retired early." "Course you did," Jake agreed, though his smirk suggested otherwise. "Just saying, a woman alone needs to be careful, especially a woman in your position." Sarah completed her purchases and escaped the store, feeling the weight of their speculation following her like a shadow. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she thought longingly of cool shadows and evening breezes, of standing on a hill overlooking endless possibilities. That afternoon, a dust storm rolled in from the west, turning the sky the color of old brass and driving everyone indoors. Sarah watched from her window as the town disappeared behind a curtain of swirling sand. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling windows and doors, seeking entry. She had weathered many such storms, but this one felt different, charged with the same restless energy that had been building in her chest since Corrigan's arrival. As evening approached and the storm showed no signs of abating, Sarah found herself pacing her small house like a caged animal. She knew she shouldn't go out in such weather, knew that he probably wouldn't be there anyway. But as the clock struck 8, she wrapped herself in her heavy cloak and slipped out into the storm. The wind hit her immediately, trying to drive her back, but she pushed forward, one hand holding her hood, the other stretched out before her. Sand stung her eyes and filled her mouth, but she pressed on, driven by a need she couldn't name. She almost walked into him. He materialized out of the storm like a specter, catching her arms to steady her. Without a word, he pulled her into the lee of the chapel, where the wind was marginally calmer. "You came," he said, having to raise his voice over the storm. "I didn't think you would, not in this." "I shouldn't have," she replied, her words nearly lost in the wind. "This is madness." "Maybe," he agreed, his hand still on her arms. "But sometimes madness is the only sane response to an insane world." He looked different in the strange light of the storm, wilder, more dangerous. Sand had collected in the creases of his coat, and his hair was disheveled, but his eyes were steady on hers, and in them she saw a reflection of her own desperate hunger. "They're saying things about you in town," she said, "about trouble in El Paso, about guns and violence." His jaw tightened. "People say a lot of things, some true, some not. Does it matter?" "It should." Sarah said, "It should matter to me who you are, what you've done. But it doesn't?" She shook her head slowly. "God help me, it doesn't. I know what I should feel, what I should do. I should turn away from you, return to my proper life, forget you ever existed. But I can't seem to." Her voice broke. "That kiss. You've ruined me." "No," he said fiercely, pulling her closer. "I have awakened you. There's a difference." The storm raged around them, and Sarah felt as if she were standing at the edge of a great precipice. One step forward and she would fall, leaving behind everything she had ever known. But hadn't she already fallen? Hadn't that kiss already pushed her over the edge? "Come with me," Corrigan said suddenly. "There's an old line shack about a mile north. We can wait out the storm there." Sarah knew what he was really asking. To go with him would be to cross a line from which there was no return. Her reputation, her position in the community, the life she had built on the foundation of her widowhood, all of it would be destroyed. But as she looked into his storm-gray eyes, she realized that life was already gone, had been crumbling since the moment he rode into town. "Yes," she whispered, and felt something break free inside her chest, like a bird escaping its cage. They struggled through the storm together, Corrigan leading the way with the sure instinct of a man used to navigating harsh terrain. The line shack, when they finally reached it, was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was shelter from the raging sand. Inside, the sudden quiet was almost shocking. Sarah pushed back her hood with shaking hands, aware that she stood on the threshold of her own destruction. Or perhaps, she thought as Corrigan lit the single lantern that sat on a rough table, her own rebirth. "Sarah," he began, but she silenced him with a gesture. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me I can still leave, still save myself. Don't give me choices. I'm so tired of being good, of being proper, of being what everyone expects. For once in my life, I want to be what I choose to be." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," he said simply. "Then choose." And she did. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the rough walls as Sarah stood trembling in the small space. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the shack, there was only the sound of their breathing and the wild beating of her heart. She felt as if she had stepped outside of time itself, into a place where the rules of her ordinary life held no power. "You're shaking," Corrigan observed softly, making no move to approach her. "I'm frightened," she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. "Not of you, of myself, of what I want." "And what do you want, Sarah?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to find words for the tumult inside her. "I want to feel alive," she whispered. "For so long, I've been walking through my days like a ghost, doing what's expected, saying what's proper." Thomas used to say that earthly desires were chains that kept us from heaven. But what if the chains are the very things he called holy? What if duty and propriety and reputation are the real prisons? She opened her eyes to find Corrigan watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I want to know what it feels like to be touched with passion, not duty. I want to be seen as a woman, not a symbol. I want—" Her voice broke, and tears began to flow. "I want so many things I'm not supposed to want." Corrigan crossed the space between them then, gathering her into his arms. Unlike their kiss on the hillside, this embrace was gentle, offering comfort rather than passion. Sarah buried her face against his chest and wept, for the girl she had been, for the dreams she had buried with her husband, for the life she was about to leave behind. "It's all right," he murmured, stroking her hair. "Let it out. You've been holding it in too long." When her tears finally subsided, Sarah pulled back slightly, embarrassed by her display. "I'm sorry. You must think me foolish." "I think you're the bravest woman I've ever met," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "It takes courage to admit what you want, even more to reach for it." She laughed shakily. "Brave? I'm terrified." "The two aren't mutually exclusive." He smiled then, that crooked smile that had haunted her dreams. "You know, when I first saw you standing in that doorway, you reminded me of a hawk I once saw caught in a snare. Magnificent creature, meant for the sky, slowly dying on the ground. I wanted to cut it free, but I knew it might attack me for my trouble." "Did you cut it free?" "I did. It clawed me good." He showed her a faint scar on the back of his hand. "But then it flew, disappeared into the blue like it had never been bound at all." Sarah traced the scar with one finger, marveling at the warmth of his skin. "Maybe I'll claw you too." "Maybe," he agreed. "But you'll fly." The storm began to subside as they talked, the howling wind fading to a mournful whisper. They sat together on the shack's single rough bench, and Corrigan told her stories of his travels, of mountains that touched the sky and deserts that stretched beyond imagining, of cities where thousands of people lived stacked atop each other and valleys where a man could ride for days without seeing another soul. "I worked the railroad for a while," he said, "laying track across the continent. Hardest work I ever did, but there was something magnificent about it, being part of binding the country together, even while I knew it meant the end of the frontier I loved." "Do you ever regret it?" The wandering. He considered the question. Sometimes, on cold nights when my bones ache and I think how nice it would be to have a hearth of my own. But then morning comes, and I see a new horizon, and I know I'm not made for settling. He paused, studying her face in the lamplight. What about you? Do you regret the life you've lived? Sarah thought of her marriage, of the years spent trying to mold herself into Thomas's ideal of a godly woman. I regret not asking questions sooner. I regret accepting answers that never satisfied me. But mostly, she met his eyes. Mostly, I regret that it took your arrival to make me realize I was slowly suffocating. The wind had died to almost nothing now, and through the small window, Sarah could see stars beginning to appear. She knew she should leave, knew that every moment she remained increased the risk of discovery. But she couldn't seem to move, couldn't break this spell of intimacy that had woven itself around them. Tell me about El Paso, she said quietly. Corrigan's expression hardened slightly. You sure you want to know? Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. There was a man, a gambler who liked to cheat desperate folks out of what little they had. I called him on it. He went for his gun. He shrugged. I was faster. And you ran? His brother's the mayor. Wouldn't have gotten a fair trial. He looked at her steadily. Does it change things, knowing I've killed? Sarah thought about it, searching her heart for the horror she should feel, but all she found was a weary acceptance of the world's harsh realities. Thomas killed too, in his way, with words instead of bullets, with shame instead of lead. At least your way is honest. Corrigan's eyes widened slightly. That's a dangerous way of thinking for a preacher's widow. I'm tired of safe thinking, Sarah said fiercely. Where has it gotten me? Alone in a house that feels like a tomb, spending my days being what everyone expects while inside I'm screaming. She stood abruptly, pacing the small space. Do you know what the worst part is? I'm not even sure I'm mourning Thomas himself. I think I'm mourning the idea of him, the security he represented. Is that terrible? It's human, Corrigan said simply. Sarah stopped pacing, standing before him with her hands clenched at her sides. I need to know something. Is this real? What's between us? Or am I just convenient? A conquest to boast about in the next town? Corrigan rose slowly, his face serious. You think I make a habit of this? Of pursuing widows and ruining reputations? I don't know what to think. He moved closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. I've been with women, Sarah. I won't lie about that. But this is different. You're different. How? Because you make me want to stop running, he said quietly. Because when I look at you, I see possibilities I thought I'd given up on. Because that kiss didn't just burn your soul, it burned mine too. Sarah's resistance crumbled. She swayed toward him, and he caught her, his mouth finding hers with desperate hunger. This kiss was different from the first, deeper, more knowing. Sarah gave herself to it completely, letting passion wash away thought and fear and propriety. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the first pale light of dawn was seeping through the window. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and new. I have to go, Sarah said, though every fiber of her being wanted to stay. If I'm not back before the town wakes, I know. Corrigan touched her face gently. But this isn't over. You know that, don't you? We've started something that can't be stopped now. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She knew he was right. Whatever happened next, she could never go back to being the woman she had been. That woman had died in this shack, burned away by passion and truth and the terrible freedom of choice. As she prepared to leave, Corrigan caught her hand. Sarah, whatever happens, whatever you decide, know this, you're already free. The cage door is open. Whether you fly or not is up to you. She squeezed his hand, then stepped out into the dawn. The world looked different somehow, sharper and more real than it had ever been. As she made her way back to town, Sarah felt as if she were walking between two worlds, the one she had always known and the one that beckoned just beyond the horizon, behind her. She knew Corrigan watched from the doorway of the shack. She didn't look back. She couldn't, because she knew that if she did, she would run to him and never leave at all. The news spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire in dry grass. By noon, Sarah could feel the weight of judgment in every glance, every whispered conversation that ceased when she approached Mrs. Garrett, who ran the boarding house, had seen Corrigan return just after dawn, his clothes dusty from the storm. Young Timothy Fletcher, out early to check on his father's cattle, had spotted a figure in widow's black making her way from the direction of the old line shack. Sarah held her head high as she went about her daily routines, but inside she felt as fragile as spun glass. In the general store, conversation stopped mid-sentence. At the well, women gathered their water quickly and hurried away. Even the children seemed to sense the shift, staring at her with wide, curious eyes before being hustled off by their mothers. It was Mrs. Hutchins who finally confronted her, arriving at Sarah's door with a delegation of the town's most prominent women. Sarah let them in, serving tea with hands that barely trembled, maintaining the facade of normalcy even as she felt the walls closing in. "We've come out of concern," Mrs. Hutchins began, her tone suggesting anything but, "There have been disturbing observations about your association with that drifter. Mr. Corrigan has been nothing but respectful," Sarah said carefully. "Respectful men don't lurk around churches at night," Mrs. Templeton interjected. "Nor do respectable widows entertain such men. I have not entertained anyone," Sarah replied, the technical truth tasting like ash in her mouth. "Perhaps not in your home," Mrs. Hutchins conceded, "but your actions have given the appearance of impropriety, and in matters of morality, appearance is everything. Your late husband understood this. He worked so hard to establish proper Christian values in this town. It would be a tragedy to see his legacy tarnished." Sarah felt anger kindle in her chest, a clean, bright flame that burned away her fear. "And what would you have me do?" "Distance yourself from this man immediately," Mrs. Hutchins said firmly. "Make it clear that his attentions are unwelcome. Better yet, encourage him to leave town, today, if possible." "And if I refuse?" The women exchanged glances. "Then we would be forced to reconsider your position here," Mrs. Hutchins said. "The house you occupy belongs to the church. Your stipend comes from the congregation. These privileges are extended to you as Thomas's widow, with the expectation that you uphold his standards." The threat was clear. Comply or be cast out. Sarah looked at these women who had pretended to be her friends, who had brought her casseroles and condolences, and saw them clearly for the first time. They were not concerned with her welfare or her virtue. They were concerned with maintaining the rigid structure that gave their own lives meaning. "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "I will give your words all the consideration they deserve." After they left, Sarah stood in her empty parlor, looking at the life she had built on the foundation of her widowhood. Every piece of furniture, every book, every small comfort had been provided by the church, by the community's charity. She owned almost nothing of her own. Even the clothes on her back had been sewn from fabric donated by the Ladies' Aid Society. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Corrigan standing there, his face grim. "I heard," he said simply. "The whole town's talking." "You shouldn't be here," Sarah said, but she stepped aside to let him in anyway. What did it matter now? The damage was done. "This is my fault," he said once the door was closed. "I should never have—" "Stop," Sarah interrupted. "I made my choice. I'm not a child to be protected from the consequences." "What will you do?" Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the town that had been her world for so long. "I don't know. They want me to send you away, to publicly reject you. If I don't, I lose everything." "Then do it," Corrigan said immediately. "Send me away. I'll leave today. You can tell them I made unwanted advances. that you rejected me. Your reputation will be restored." Sarah turned to face him, seeing the pain in his eyes, the willingness to sacrifice himself for her. "And then what? I go back to being the ghost of Thomas McKenna? I pretend that last night didn't happen, that I haven't finally understood what it means to be alive? Being alive isn't worth much if you're starving," he said roughly. "You have no money, no family. What would you do without the church's support?" It was a valid question, one that should have terrified her. Instead, Sarah felt a strange calm descend. "I would survive," she said. "Women have been surviving without men's charity since the beginning of time. I can sew, cook, take in laundry. I can teach children their letters. I can make my way. In this town, they'd never hire you, not if you're marked as a fallen woman. Then I'll go somewhere else." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but she knew they were true. "Somewhere I'm not the preacher's widow. Somewhere I can just be Sarah." Corrigan crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You know I can't offer you anything. I have no home, no steady work. I'm a wanted man in Texas. I can't promise you security or respectability. I've had both," Sarah said. "They're not worth as much as people think." Before he could respond, there was another knock at the door, louder this time, more insistent. Sarah recognized Sheriff Thompson's heavy fist even before she heard his voice. "Mrs. McKenna, need to speak with you and your visitor." Sarah and Corrigan exchanged glances. She squeezed his hands once, then went to open the door. The sheriff stood there with 2 deputies, their faces set in lines of official disapproval. "Sheriff," Sarah said calmly, "how can I help you?" "Ma'am." Thompson touched his hat brim briefly. "I'm going to need Mr. Corrigan to come with me. There's been a complaint." "What manner of complaint?" Corrigan asked, stepping into view. "Public disturbance, moral corruption, creating unrest." The sheriff's expression was apologetic but firm. "Mr. Barton, who owns the Double Bar Ranch, has formally requested your removal from town. As a prominent citizen and member of the town council, his word carries weight." Sarah knew Barton, a sanctimonious hypocrite who visited the saloon girls regularly but sat in the front pew every Sunday. "On what grounds?" she demanded. "On the grounds that your presence here is disrupting the peace and corrupting the morals of our womenfolk," Thompson said, looking directly at Corrigan. "Now, you can come quietly and leave town within the hour, or I can arrest you and let Judge Cooper sort it out. Your choice." Sarah felt rage course through her. This is persecution. He's done nothing wrong. "Maybe not," Thompson agreed. "But sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes keeping the peace means removing the source of conflict, right or wrong." He looked at Corrigan. "What's it going to be?" Corrigan studied the sheriff for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll go. No need for arrests or judges. Give me an hour to gather my things and settle my bill at the boarding house." "Jack, no," Sarah protested, but he silenced her with a look. "It's best this way," he said. "For both of us." But Sarah saw the message in his eyes, heard what he wasn't saying. This wasn't over. This was merely a strategic retreat, not a surrender. The sheriff and his deputies escorted Corrigan out, leaving Sarah alone in her parlor. She stood there for a moment, then moved with sudden purpose. She pulled out her old carpet bag from beneath the bed and began to pack. Not much. She owned so little that was truly hers. Her mother's Bible, a few photographs, the plain gold ring Thomas had placed on her finger 5 years ago. She looked at the ring for a long moment, remembering the girl who had accepted it with such hope, such faith in the future it represented. Then, with deliberate care, she removed it and placed it on the mantel. That girl was gone, had been dying slowly for years. It was time to bury her completely. As she packed, Sarah's mind raced. She had perhaps a day before the church elders formally evicted her, a day to decide where to go, what to do. But underneath the fear and uncertainty, she felt something else, a wild exhilaration, as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump. Through her window, she could see Corrigan being escorted to the boarding house. He walked with his head high, unashamed and unbroken. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, their eyes meeting across the distance. He touched his hat brim in a gesture that looked like farewell but felt like a promise. Sarah pressed her hand against the glass, watching until he disappeared from view. Soon, she knew, it would be her turn to disappear. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The evening brought an uneasy quiet to Redemption Creek. Word had spread that the drifter had been given his marching orders, but there was no celebration in the town's victory. Instead, there was a watchful tension, as if everyone were waiting for the second shoe to drop. Sarah sat in her small kitchen, her packed carpet bag hidden beneath the bed. Through her window, she could see men gathering outside, not a mob exactly, but close enough to make her heart pound. She recognized Jake Morrison and several ranch hands from the Double Bar, along with others who frequented the saloon. They carried torches against the gathering darkness, and their voices carried on the still air. "The sheriff's too soft," she heard Morrison say, giving that drifter time to settle his affairs. "Man like that don't have affairs to settle. 'Cept maybe with the widow." Harsh laughter greeted this remark. Sarah forced herself to remain still, to not react to their crude implications, but her hands clenched in her lap, nails digging into her palms. A knock at her door made her jump. She approached cautiously, but the voice that called out wasn't one of the mob's. "Mrs. McKenna, it's Dr. Hartwell. Please, I must speak with you." Sarah opened the door to find the elderly doctor standing there, his medical bag in hand. Behind him, she could see the crowd of men notice his presence, their voices dropping to angry mutters. "Doctor, is someone ill? May I come in?" He glanced meaningfully at the gathering crowd. "Quickly, please." Once inside, "Doctor." Hartwell set down his bag and faced her with grave concern. "Sarah, forgive the familiarity, but there's no time for formality. That crowd isn't here for pleasant conversation. Word is they plan to ensure the drifter leaves town tonight, one way or another." The sheriff's been called away. Convenient, isn't it? A supposed disturbance at the Murphy Ranch that will keep him occupied for hours. The doctor's lined face was grim. "Mr. Corrigan is at the boarding house, packing as ordered, but I fear he won't make it to his horse alive. Not with that mob working up their courage in whiskey and righteousness." Sarah felt ice form in her veins. "They'll kill him. Or near enough. Frontier justice. They'll call it protecting the town's virtue." "Doctor," Hartwell pulled out a folded paper. "I've written a letter of recommendation for you. My cousin in Colorado Springs runs a respectable boarding house and could use help. It's not much, but it's a start." Sarah took the letter with trembling hands. "Why are you helping me?" The old doctor smiled sadly. "Because I've lived long enough to see what happens when fear and self-righteousness combine. Because your husband, for all his virtues, never understood that grace means more than judgment. And because that young man at the boarding house saved my grandson's life once, though he doesn't know I know it. He did. 2 years ago, in Denver, my grandson was being robbed, beaten badly. A stranger intervened, fought off 3 men, never gave his name, just made sure the boy got to a doctor and disappeared. But I'd know those gray eyes anywhere when he rode into town." Sarah clutched the letter, her mind racing. "The mob, we have to warn him." "Already done. Mrs. Garrett slipped out the back and went to alert him, but he refused to run. Said he'd leave as ordered, in his own time, on his own terms." The doctor shook his head. "Stubborn fool." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see the mob moving, heading down the hill toward town. Their torches bobbed like fireflies in the darkness, and their voices had taken on the ugly tone of men convincing themselves that violence was virtue. "Go to him." "Doctor," Hartwell urged. "There's a back way through the churchyard. You might reach the boarding house before they do." "Come with me," Sarah said, already moving toward her hidden carpet bag. "I'm too old for running, my dear. Besides, Someone needs to stay here, to witness what happens, to ensure the truth is told, whatever that truth might be. He squeezed her shoulder. Go! Now! Sarah grabbed her bag and slipped out the back door. The cemetery stretched before her, headstones glowing pale in the moonlight. She ran between them, her skirts catching on the rough grass, Thomas's grave passing in a blur. She felt no guilt leaving it behind, only urgency to reach the living. The back alley behind the boarding house was empty when she arrived, breathless and disheveled. She could hear the mob approaching from Main Street, their voices growing louder, uglier. Sarah slipped through the rear entrance, nearly colliding with Mrs. Garrett in the darkened hallway. "Lord have mercy," the older woman gasped. "Mrs. McKenna, you shouldn't be here. Where is he? Mrs.?" Garrett's face was etched with worry. "In his room, cleaning those guns of his. I tried to convince him to slip out the back, but he won't budge. Says he's paid for the room until morning and means to use it." Sarah pushed past her, taking the stairs 2 at a time. She found Corrigan's door and entered without knocking. He looked up from the gun he was loading, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Sarah, what are you—" "They're coming," she interrupted. "A mob. They mean to hurt you, maybe kill you. I know." He continued loading the gun with steady hands. "Mrs. Garrett told me." "Then why are you still here?" He set the gun aside and stood, crossing to her in 2 quick strides. "Because running from a mob gives them power. Because I said I'd leave in the morning, and I keep my word. And because—" he cupped her face in his hands. "Because I hoped you'd come." "This is insane," Sarah said, tears stinging her eyes. "Your pride isn't worth your life." "It's not pride," he said softly. "It's principle. A man's got to draw lines, decide what he'll accept and what he won't. I've been pushed from too many towns by too many small men. Not this time." The sound of breaking glass from below made them both freeze. The mob had arrived. "Corrigan," Morrison's voice boomed from the street. "Come on out. Time for you to leave our town." Jack moved to the window, peering down at the street. About a dozen of them, drunk, but not too drunk, armed, but hoping not to use their guns. He glanced at Sarah. "They want to beat me, humiliate me, send me crawling out of town as a warning to others. Open up!" Someone was pounding on the boarding house door now. "We know you're in there." "Mrs." Garrett's voice, high and frightened, protested the intrusion. There was the sound of splintering wood as they forced their way in. Jack checked his guns one more time, then surprised Sarah by holstering them. "I won't shoot unless I have to. These aren't evil men, just scared ones. Scared of change, of anything that threatens their small, safe world." "They're coming up the stairs," Sarah said, hearing the heavy boots on the boards. "Get behind me," Jack ordered. But Sarah stepped forward instead, placing herself between him and the door. "No, they won't hurt me. I'm still the preacher's widow, whatever else they think of me." "Sarah!" The door burst open, and Morrison stood there with 3 other men, their faces flushed with drink and righteousness. They stopped short at the sight of Sarah. Well, Morrison sneered. "The widow herself. Come to say goodbye to your lover." "I've come to prevent murder," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Or are you so lost to decency that you'd attack an unarmed man?" "Unarmed?" One of the men laughed harshly. "He's got 3 guns we know of, which I haven't drawn," Jack said calmly, his hands visible and empty. "And won't, unless you force me to." Morrison pushed past Sarah, getting in Jack's face. "You corrupted a good woman, brought shame to our town. Man like you needs to learn respect." "Respect is earned, not beaten into people," Jack replied. "And I've done nothing to be ashamed of." "Nothing?" Morrison's face was ugly with rage. "You've got the preacher's widow defending you like a common—" "Careful." Jack's voice went deadly quiet. "Very careful what you say next." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Sarah could see hands inching toward weapons, could feel violence hovering like a living thing. Then, unexpectedly, a new voice cut through the standoff. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher who served several frontier towns, standing in the doorway. He was a younger man than Thomas had been, with kind eyes and a quiet authority. "Reverend," Morrison blustered, "we're just ensuring this troublemaker leaves town as ordered." "With fists and threats?" Matthews entered the room, his presence somehow making the mob seem smaller, shabbier. "Is this what our faith has taught us? To form mobs in the night like the very Romans who crucified our Lord?" "He's corrupted the widow," someone protested. Matthews looked at Sarah with compassion. "Has he forced you to anything against your will, Mrs. McKenna?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "Everything I've done has been my choice." "Then the sin, if sin there is, lies not in corruption but in choice. And last I checked, the Lord gave us free will for a reason." Matthews faced the mob. "Go home, all of you. Go to your wives, your children, your own consciences. Leave judgment to God and the law to the sheriff." One by one, the men filed out, some shame-faced, others still muttering. Morrison was the last to go, shooting one more venomous look at Jack before stomping down the stairs. When they were gone, Matthews turned to Jack. "You'll leave in the morning, as promised." Jack confirmed. The Reverend nodded, then looked at Sarah. "And you, Mrs. McKenna, what will you do?" Sarah lifted her chin. "I'll be leaving as well. The town has made it clear I'm no longer welcome." "I'm sorry for that," Matthews said sincerely. "Thomas would have—" He stopped, shaking his head. "No, perhaps it's time to stop invoking Thomas. He's gone, and the living must make their own choices." He moved toward the door, then paused. "There's a stage heading north at first light. It stops here to change horses, just so you know." After he left, Sarah and Jack stood in silence for a moment. Then she laughed, a shaky sound that was half sob. A minister who actually understands mercy, will wonders never cease. Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "You were magnificent," he murmured into her hair. "Standing up to them like that. I was terrified," she admitted. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it." He pulled back to look at her. "Sarah, about the morning." "I know," she interrupted. "You have to leave. So do I." "That's not what I was going to say." He smiled, that crooked smile. "I was going to say that stage Matthews mentioned has room for 2, if you're interested." Sarah's heart soared, but she forced herself to be practical. "Where would we go?" "North. Colorado, maybe, or Wyoming. Somewhere we can start fresh." He grew serious. "I can't offer you much. Life with me won't be easy, but I can offer you freedom and respect and whatever love a wandering man has to give." Sarah thought of the life she was leaving behind, the security, the position, the known world of Redemption Creek. Then she thought of the life stretching ahead, uncertain, possibly difficult, but alive with possibility. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." They spent the rest of the night planning, talking, holding each other as if they could stop time through sheer will, and when the first pale light of dawn touched the sky, they were ready. Dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold as Sarah stood at the edge of town, her carpetbag in hand. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Behind her, Redemption Creek still slumbered, its buildings dark shapes against the brightening horizon. She had walked through its streets one last time, saying silent farewells to the life she was leaving behind. Jack waited by the stage stop, his horse saddled and ready. He had decided to ride alongside the stage rather than take a seat inside. Old habits died hard, and he preferred the freedom of his own mount. When he saw her approaching, his face lit with a smile that made her heart skip. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently as she reached him. Sarah looked back at the town, at the church steeple rising above the other buildings like a finger pointing toward heaven. "No," she said firmly. "Only first thoughts about what comes next." The stage arrived in a cloud of dust and jangling harnesses, the driver calling out greetings and complaints about the rough roads in equal measure. Sarah climbed aboard, settling her small bag at her feet. Through the window, she could see early risers beginning to emerge from their homes. Mrs. Hutchins stood on her porch, her face a mask of disapproval. Sarah met her gaze steadily, offering a small nod of farewell that was neither apology nor defiance, simply acknowledgement. As the stage lurched into motion, Jack riding alongside, Sarah saw other faces appear, Dr. Hartwell raising his hand in blessing, Mrs. Garrett wiping tears from her cheeks, even Reverend Matthews standing quietly by the church, his expression thoughtful. Not everyone condemned her choice. She realized. Some understood, even if they couldn't say so aloud. The miles rolled by, taking them farther from Redemption Creek with each turn of the wheels. Sarah found herself relaxing in increments, the tight knot in her chest slowly unwinding. A fellow passenger, a mining engineer heading to Colorado, engaged her in pleasant conversation about the weather and the prospects for silver in the mountains. It felt strange to be just another traveler, not the preacher's widow or poor Mrs. McKenna. At the first way station, where they stopped to change horses, Jack helped her down from the stage. His hands lingered on her waist, and she didn't step away. "How are you faring?" he asked, searching her face. "Free," she said, the word tasting sweet on her tongue. "I feel free." They shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread with the other passengers, and Sarah marveled at the ordinariness of it. No one here knew her story, her past, the scandal she was leaving behind. She was simply a woman traveling north, perhaps to meet family, perhaps to take a position. The anonymity was intoxicating. As they prepared to continue, Jack drew her aside. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his expression serious. "About where we're headed. I have a friend in Colorado Springs, runs a small ranch. He's offered me work before. Honest work. Nothing that would bring the law down on us. It's not much, but it's a start." "You never mentioned this before," Sarah observed. He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "Never had a reason to consider it before. Settling down seemed like surrender. But now—" He took her hands in his. "Now I have something worth stopping for." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Jack Corrigan, are you saying you'd give up the open road for me?" "I'm saying I'd like to try," he corrected. "Can't promise I'll be good at it. Might get restless. Might need to take work that carries me away sometimes. But I'd always come back, if you'll have me." "Yes," Sarah said, not needing to think about it. "Yes to trying. Yes to whatever comes." They traveled through the day, the landscape changing from the flat, dusty plains around Redemption Creek to rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen. Sarah watched it all with hungry eyes, storing up images of this new world she was entering. When they stopped for the night at a way station, she stood outside watching the stars emerge, more brilliant than she'd ever seen them. Jack found her there, draping his coat around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Regrets?" he asked. "None," Sarah said, leaning back against his solid warmth. "I was just thinking about something you said that first night, about the kiss that burned my soul. And—" she turned in his arms to face him. "It did burn me, burned away everything false, everything that wasn't truly me. What's left might not be much, a woman with no home, no reputation, no certainty about tomorrow. But it's real. It's mine." He kissed her then, under the vast canopy of stars, and Sarah felt the last of her old life fall away like shed skin. When they finally drew apart, she was crying and laughing at the same time. "What is it?" Jack asked, concerned. "I just realized," she said, wiping her tears. "For the first time in my life, I don't know what's going to happen next, and it's wonderful." They reached Colorado Springs 3 days later, the young town bustling with miners and merchants, dreamers and schemers. Jack's friend, a weathered rancher named Ben Taylor, welcomed them warmly. He was a widower himself, understanding something of second chances and new beginnings. "It ain't fancy," Ben said, showing them the small cabin on his property where they could stay. "But it's solid, and it's private. You can help with the horses. Jack and Mrs. Sorry, what should I call you? Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then smiled. Just Sarah. Sarah Corrigan. Jack's eyes widened slightly. They hadn't discussed marriage yet, but he said nothing, only squeezed her hand. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home watching the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the stifling propriety of Redemption Creek to this rough but honest new life. From the preacher's widow to simply Sarah, it had been a transformation as complete as any resurrection. Do you miss it? Jack asked. The security? The respectability? Sarah considered the question. I miss some of the people. Dr. Hartwell, Mrs. Garrett. But the life itself? No, that life was killing me slowly, one proper day at a time. And this life? She looked at him. This man who had awakened her to possibilities she'd never imagined. This life might kill me too, she admitted. But at least I'll die living. Jack laughed, pulling her close. That's my wild woman, though I promise to do my best to keep us both alive and thriving. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Sarah thought one more time of Redemption Creek, of the churchyard where Thomas lay, of the woman she had been. She wished them all peace, even those who had driven her away. They were living according to their own understanding, just as she was finally living according to hers. What are you thinking? Jack asked, feeling her sigh. Sarah smiled, breathing in the scent of pine and possibility. I was thinking about that preacher's widow who hid her desire. I hope she found peace, wherever she is. And the woman who took her place. She's not hiding anything anymore, Sarah said, turning to kiss him under the infinite sky. In the morning, there would be work to do, a life to build, a future to create from nothing but hope and determination. There would be challenges she couldn't yet imagine, joys she had never dared dream of. But tonight, sitting on the porch of a rough cabin with a man who saw her truly, Sarah Corrigan was exactly where she belonged. The prairie wind sang its eternal song of freedom and distance, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. Sarah listened to these wild sounds and smiled, knowing that she had finally found her place in their chorus. The preacher's widow was gone, buried deeper than any grave. In her place stood a woman reborn, shaped by fire and choice into something altogether new. And as Jack had promised on that night that seemed a lifetime ago, she had learned to fly. Thank you for listening to this tale from the American frontier. I hope Sarah and Jack's story touched your heart as it did mine. Where are you enjoying this story from? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know if you're listening from a big city or a small town, from America or somewhere across the globe. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic tales of love, redemption, and the untamed spirit of the Old West. What did you think of Sarah's journey? Share your thoughts below.